Welcome to Chapter 3 of The Bark-Covered House by William Knowlins. Again, this is a story about frontier life in Michigan in the 1830s. This chapter 3, is called How We Got Our Sweet and the History of My First Pig. Sounds like a fun chapter. We made troughs, tapped hard maples on each side of the creek, took our oxen, sled, and 2 barrels, as the trees were scattered, to draw the sap to the place we had prepared for boiling it. Now I had an employment entirely new to me, boiling down sap and making sugar in the woods of Michigan. This was quite a help to us in getting along. We made our own sweet and vinegar, also some sugar and molasses to sell. Some springs we made 300 or 400 pounds of sugar. Sugar was not all the good things that we had, for there was one added to my father's family, a little sister, who was none the less lovely in my eye because she was of Michigan, a native Wolverine. Now, father's family, all told, consisted of mother and 6 children. The children grew to be men and women and are all alive to this day, January 26, 1875. After we came to Michigan, Mother's health constantly improved, and she soon began to like her new home and become more cheerful and happy. I told her we had what would be a beautiful place, far better than the rocks and the hills that we left. I often renewed my promise that if she and I lived and I grew to be a man, we would go back and visit her friends and see again the land of her nativity. To cheer her still more, we received a letter from Mr. G. Purdy of York State, telling us that he was coming to Michigan in the fall with his wife, my mother's beloved sister Abby, and her youngest sister Sarah were coming with them. Asa Blair, the young man who picked up the Indian knife, bought 40 acres of land adjoining us on the east and built him a house and went to Ohio, married, and brought his wife back to him. Now we had neighbors on the east of us, and Mr. Henry Davis, a brother-in-law of Mr. Pardee, came and bought land adjoining Mr. Pardee on the west, built and settled with a large family. About the same time, many families from the east came and settled along the creek for miles west of us. Getting a little warm. Now we were on the border of civilization. Our next clearing of any importance was the little ridge. Father commenced around the edge, cut the brush, and threw them from the ridge all around it to form a brush fence. And then all the trees that would fall in a line of the fence were next felled, and also all that would fall over it. And then those which would reach the fence were felled toward it. Then we trimmed and cut logs, piled the brush on the fence. I felt very much interested in clearing this place. When Father took his axe and started for work, I took mine, and was immediately at his side or a little behind him. And in this manner we returned, and we soon had 2 acres cut off and surrounded by an immense log treetop and brush fence. At least I thought it was a great fence. Now came the logging and burning. Father worked with his oxen in the handspike, and I with my handspike. Some of the large logs near the fence he swung around with the oxen and left them by it. Others he drew together, and when we piled them up, Father took his handspike and rolled the log, and I held it with mine until he got a new hold, and in this way I helped him roll hundreds and thousands of logs, and we soon had them all in heaps. But they were green and burned slowly, and some of them would not burn at all. We scratched around them and put some seeds in every spot. We could do but very little with the plow. Father made a drag out of a crotch of a tree and put iron teeth in it. This did us some service, as the land was rather rooty. In raising our summer crop, we had to do most of the work with a hoe. Sometimes, where it was very rooty, we planted corn with an axe. In order to do this, we struck the blade into the ground and the roots about 2 inches, and then dropped the corn in and struck it again 2 or 3 inches from the first place which closed it, and the hill of corn was planted. Now I must go back to the first season and tell how I got my first pig. It was the first of the hog species we owned in Michigan. Father went to the village and I with him. From there we went down to Mr. Townsends, the man who moved us out from Detroit. He wished Father to see his hogs, and we went to the yard, and as it was my habit, I followed along. Mr. Thompson called the hogs up, and I thought he had some very fine ones. Among them was an old sow that had some pigs. She seemed to be very cross, and raised her bristles, and growled at us, as much as to say, "Let my pigs alone." I suppose Mr. Thompson thought he would have some sport with me, and being generous, he said, "If the boy will catch one, I'll give it to him." I selected one and started. I paid no attention to the old sow, but kept my eye on the pig I wanted, and the way I went for it was a caution. I caught it, ran for the fence, with the old sow after me. I got over very quickly, and was safe with my pig in my arms. I started home. It kicked and squealed and tried to get away, but I held it tightly and patted it and called it Piggy. I said to myself, now I have a pig of my own, and it will soon grow up and be a hog, and we'll have pork. When I got home, I put it in a barrel and covered it up so that it could not get out. And then I took my axe and cut poles and made a new pen and put it on one place in Adam's world where pig and pig pen had never been seen before. Now, thought I, I've got an axe, a pig, and a gun. One morning, a day or two after this, I went out, and the pig was gone. Thinking that it might have gone home, I went to Mr. Townsends and inquired if they had seen it. I looked in the yard, but the pig was not there. I made up my mind that it was lost, and I started home. And I followed the old trail, and when within 60 yards of the place where I now live, I met my pig. I was very glad to see it, but it turned from me and ran right into the woods. The pig seemed running for its life, and I for my property, which was going off over logs and through the brush as fast as its legs could carry it. It had a hard chase, and I caught the pig and I took it back and I made the pen stronger and I put it in again, but it would not eat much, and in a few days after died. And away went my imaginary pork. Mr. Pardee had bought a piece of land for Mr. Clapp of Peekskill, New York, and was agent for same. He said the south end of this land was opening. It was about 1 mile from our place, and Mr. Pardee offered to join with Father and put corn on it. Accordingly, we went to see it. There was some brush, but it was mostly covered with what we call buffalo grass, which grew spontaneously. Cattle loved it very much in the summer, but their grazing, it seemed, to destroy it. It soon died out and mostly disappeared, scrub oak and other brush coming up in its place. Mr. Pardee and Father soon cleared 5 or 6 acres of this land, and with the brush they cut, made a light brush fence around it, then tore up 3 or 4 acres and planted it with corn. The soil was very light yellow sand. When the corn came up, it was small and yellow. They put in about 2 acres of buckwheat. A young man by the name of William Beale worked for Pardee, and he helped to tend the corn. And one morning, as they were going up to hoe the corn, William Beale took his gun and started ahead. This he frequently did very early. He said, when about halfway to the corn, he looked forward toward the creek and saw a black bear coming toward him. He stood in the path leading to the cornfield, which they had underbrushed. The bear did not discover him until he was near enough, and when he fired and shot him dead. This raised quite an excitement among us. I went to see the bear. It was the first wild one I saw in Michigan. They dressed it, and so far as I know, the neighbors each had a piece. At all events, we had some. They hoed the corn once or twice, and then made up their minds that it was no use, as it would not amount to much, the land being too poor. The whole crop of corn gathered there, green at that, nubbins and all, was put into a half a bushel basket, except what the squirrels took. The buckwheat did not amount to much either. Wild turkeys trampled it down and ate the grain, and in doing which many of them lost their lives. I began to consider myself quite a marksman. I had already, with my father's rifle, shot 2 deer and had gotten some of the turkeys. Father never cropped it any more on that opening, and his experience there made him much more pleased with his own farm. The land is near me, and I have seen a great many crops growing on it, both grain and other crops, but never a one that I thought would pay the husbandman for his labor. Father's partnership with Mr. Pardee was so unsuccessful on the opening, and in having to take the oxen back and buy hay for them when that article was very high, their running out helped him some, that he concluded to go into partnership with Mr. Pardee no more. He sold half of his oxen to Asa Blair, who paid the money down. So their partnership opened in a little better shape. This partnership, Father said, was necessary as our money was becoming very much reduced, and everything we bought, such as flour and pork, were extremely dear. Besides, we had no way to make a farthing except with our maple sweet or a hide deer. Father could not get work, for there were but few settlers and none near him who were able to hire. So he economized to save his money as much as possible and worked at home. The clearing near the house grew larger and larger, and now we could see the beautiful sun earlier. Father worked very hard and got 3 acres cleared and ready for wheat. Then he went away, and he bought about 4 bushels of white wheat for seed. This cost a snug sum in those days. About the last of August he sowed it and dragged it in with his drag. He sowed about a bushel and a peck to an acre. I have, for many years back and to the present time, sown 2 bushels to the acre. His wheat came up and looked beautiful, and the next spring and early summer it was very nice. One day a neighbor's unruly ox broke into it. I went through it to drive him out, and it was knee-high, and Father said to take the ox home, and I did so. The neighbor was eating his dinner, and I told him his ox had been in our wheat, and that Father wished him to keep his ox away, and he said that we must make the fence better, and he would not get in. This was the first unkind word I'd received from a neighbor in Michigan. The wheat escaped the rust, headed and filled well, and was an excellent crop, and it helped us a great deal and was our manna in the wilderness. Father and I continued our cropping until we connected the 2 clearings, and then we commenced to see the sun in the morning and thought it shone brighter here than it did in York State. Some of the neighbors said it really did, and that it might be on account of the reflection from the water of the Great Lakes. Perhaps it was because the deep gloom of the forest had shaded us so long and was now removed. Israel-like, we looked back and longed for the good things we had left, vis-a-vis apples, pears, and the quince sauce. Even apples were luxuries we could not get, and we greatly missed them. We cleared new ground and sowed turnip seed, dragged it, and raised some very nice turnips. At this time there was not a wagon in the neighborhood. Mr. Traverse, being a mechanic and ingenious, cut down a tree and sawed off 2 short logs and used them for hubs and made the wheels for a cart. These he took to Dearborn and had them iron hoft, or shoed with iron. He made the body himself and then had an ox cart. This was the only wheeled vehicle in the place for some years. As Mr. Traverse was an obliging man, the neighbors borrowed his cart. Sometimes it went to Dearbornville to bring in provisions and other things, and sometimes it went to the mill. There was a mill on the River Rouge, 1 mile north of Dearbornville. And with this cart and ox, the neighbors carried some of their first products, sugar, butter, eggs, etc., to Detroit. Some young sightseers who had not seen Detroit since they moved into the woods and wished to see it were on board. They had to start before midnight so that it would be cool traveling for the oxen. This was the first cart and oxen seen in Detroit from our part of the town of Dearborn. They reached home the following night about 10 o'clock and told me about the trip. We wanted apples, so Father took his oxen and went and borrowed the cart and loaded it with turnips, and went down the river road halfway to Detroit and traded them with a Frenchman for apples, and brought home a load which were to us delicious fruit. And in this way we got our apples for many years. These apples were small, not so large and nice as those we had been used to having, But they were Michigan apples, and we appreciated them very much. They lasted us through the winter and did us much good. Chapter 3 of the Bark-Covered House. Just tremendous, wonderful stories about what's going on in Pioneer, Michigan in the 1830s. And we can get at that same kind of glimpse of not only what's happening in the 1830s, but as we move east, the same kind of thing would have been happening in Pennsylvania and in other parts that were frontier earlier on to the east. So great stories, and I really enjoy David Knowlins' readings or writings here. Just a lot of fun. I want to thank you for coming along on this Michigan adventure, and I hope you have a tremendous day. Thanks for watching.